And J. Reuben Clark, a year out of law school, finds himself in a situation where, in many important ways, he was actually running U.S. foreign policy.
While Solicitor Scott attended overseas conferences and basked in university lectures, Reuben was handed a case that would catch the public's eye. The Russian ambassador requested the arrest and extradition of Jan Purin, accusing him of crimes from arson to murder. Purin was living in New York and pleaded for asylum to stay. He was not Russian, but a Latvian revolutionary who had fought against the Russian Tsar. The Purin case became political and passed from President Roosevelt to the Secretary of State Root to Solicitor Scott, which meant it now belonged to Reuben. In the beginning, Reuben concurred with President Roosevelt's opinion that the Latvian should be extradited. But after compiling historical documents and completing extensive research, Reuben recommended granting Purin political asylum. The recognition for Reuben's analysis went to James Brown Scott, the solicitor in absentia.
I think that sets the pattern for what happens his whole life. He's the guy who does the work. He's the one who actually gets the hay in the barn. Other people are stepping in and taking the bows. And Clark had the kind of humility that says, in effect, look, I can help center these guys. I can help hold them on course because I know where we're going. Let them take the bows. Let them sort of strut on the stage. I don't need to do that. I don't need titles, and I don't need a flashy life.
Someone did recognize Reuben's extraordinary abilities. Newly elected President William Howard Taft appointed Philander Knox as his Secretary of State, and Knox appointed Reuben as Solicitor of the State Department. From 1910 through 1913, Reuben played a key role in formulating and implementing U.S. policies with Mexico. With the election of President Woodrow Wilson, Clark resigned from the State Department for private practice. He was 42 years old.
And then he opened his own offices. I say offices because he had an office in Washington and he had an office in New York. He would spend generally the first 3 days of the week in Washington. Then at midnight he'd get the train and go to New York, then spend all day Friday and Saturday, the latter part of the week in New York.
In the first year of private practice, Reuben completed over 1,200 investment proposals spanning 5 continents. He was prospering, but war was on the horizon.
American ships have been sunk, American lives taken. Our motive will not be revenge, but only the vindication of right, of human rights, of which we are only a single champion. With a profound sense of the solemn, I advise that the Congress declare the recent course of the Imperial German government to be in fact nothing less than war against the government and people of the United States.
As the U.S. entered World War I, Reuben closed his law offices and joined the Army, commissioned as a major in the Judge Advocate General's office. He was 46 years old. His military salary was 1/10 of his annual private law practice earnings.
Time after time, he turned down opportunities because he believed that there were more important things to be done and they really didn't have a price tag. That's what I mean by sticking to his route, sticking to his course, and not being sidetracked. And I would hasten to add, he dreamed of riches. He wanted a lucrative law practice. He had 3 law offices at one time in his life, all of them going sort of side by side. And yet, when the opportunity came to really sacrifice something of importance, for mere lucre. He always chose the thing of importance. He did that routinely. He did that his whole life.
At the beginning, I did want to do certain things and had to give up. But my life has been made most largely by merely doing the work of the day as the day came, one job after another.
My grandfather was very patriotic, due in large measure to the fact that his father, my great-grandfather, served in the Civil War. And everything that grandfather did, he gave it his whole heart. It was 100%. And I think that he felt at the time that it was appropriate for him to serve a stint in the military, which he did. And he threw himself into that with the same vigor and the same dedication and focus that he did with everything else he did. So much so that one of the honors he received was the highest non-combatant honor that the military can give.
At the time he completed his military service, Reuben and Louisine had 4 children: Louise, Marion, J. Reuben Clark III, and the youngest, Louisine. He then opened a law office in Utah, but didn't spend much time there. He was asked by President Coolidge to take charge of the United States-Mexico Mixed Claims Commission. In October 1927, he left for Mexico City at the request of the new Mexican ambassador, Dwight Morrow.
Dwight Morrow went all around this country interviewing different people to try to find the man who was thought generally to be the best legal mind, to be his legal advisor in Mexico. Everywhere he went, he got the same response: J. Reuben Clark, J. Reuben Clark, J. Reuben Clark.
Dwight Morrow, who was a very, very wealthy man, turned to him and said, "Reuben, of all the men I have known in my life, you are the least impressed with wealth." And he made some quip about, well, that's because I've never had any, or something like that. But I think the deeper message there was he wasn't impressed with wealth. He wasn't impressed with titles. He was not impressed with power. He wasn't impressed with position. Because I think he sort of saw all of us as standing directly before God in some way. And if you have that view of the world, you're going to be humble.
In October of 1930, President Herbert Hoover appointed J. Reuben Clark ambassador to Mexico. Life as ambassador began with a flourish. In full formal dress, J. Reuben Clark presented his credentials to the Mexican president. He was 59 years old.
He loved those Mexican people. From a church standpoint, while he was there, because officially church and state couldn't coexist in that, and especially in Mexico at that time. But he would get in the car, the embassy car, and he would drive out, and he would go, and he would attend his meetings out with those Mexican saints. And he'd sit down with them on the floor. He would laugh with them. And that relationship that he had with those Mexican saints was wonderful. They loved him. He was greatly admired, greatly appreciated.
On December 11th, 1931, with the death of his second counselor, Charles W. Nibley, LDS Church President Heber J. Grant was searching for a replacement.
It was at the funeral, and just right out of the blue, President Grant turns to him and says, "I know who we're going to get to take his place. We're going to get Clark, the ambassador to Mexico." And that was a shock, because it came right out of left field, right out of the blue. This was not a name on anyone's list of hopefuls for the first presidency. It was a remarkable incident. I mean, if you think about instances where some sort of divine influence is dramatically exerted on the course of the church, I can't think of one to compare with it, really, since the times of Joseph and Brigham.
A few days before Christmas, Reuben received a letter from President Grant asking him to serve as a counselor in the first presidency. For one who had never served in a position of church leadership, The high calling came as a great surprise and shock. Overwhelmed, Reuben drafted a reply.
Dear brethren, I have never aspired to church office. Its honor and dignity I appreciate, but its responsibilities seem too grave. But when a call comes, charged with the responsibility of presiding over the church, then I, responsive to my training and my faith, must answer the call. It is for the Lord to say when and where I shall serve.
Over the next months, Reuben managed to complete his governmental duties, and with the Democratic landslide in the November election of 1932, his resignation as ambassador of Mexico came at an opportune time. On April 6, 1933, J. Reuben Clark was sustained as second counselor to President Heber J. Grant in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He was 61 years old.
The Lord speaks of bringing the church out of obscurity and darkness. We have suffered over the years with a reputation of being an obscure kind of religion. We need to do everything we can to disabuse that concept, to lead the church out of obscurity and darkness. He won a reputation as a lawyer in the State Department initially, and he never was ashamed of his religion. He never betrayed his religion in any way.
Like he had done in all positions, J. Reuben Clark immediately went to work. He devoted most of his attention to the looming economic crisis of the Great Depression and its effects on the members of the church.
During the Great Depression, when our people were suffering so terribly, his heart bled for the poor and those in distress and need. And he was instrumental as a counselor to President Grant in setting up the welfare program, first known as the Church Security Program, and then came to be known as the Church Welfare Program.
The Church Welfare Committee met regularly during this developmental phase until President Clark's concept was formally presented to the church in 1936 and accepted by the saints as the Lord's will for his people. On December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked. This national tragedy was a personal one for the Clark family. Mervyn Benyon, Louise's husband, was killed on board his battleship West Virginia.
Grandfather, with all of his connections, his network, found out quite quickly that Mervyn had been killed. And he stood in front of the window and stared out the window for a long time, contemplating, trying to get his emotions in check. He had great respect and great love for Mervyn. Grandfather stared out that window for a long time. One of the comments he made when he came out of his reverie was, I'm glad he didn't have to kill anybody.
In the summer of 1944, and after 46 years of marriage, Louisine died after a short illness. His widowed daughter Louise moved in with President Clark and would stay with him until his death. It was lonely for President Clark. He began spending more time at his farm in Grantsville. He'd continued his work as a counselor under President Heber J. Grant, and following the prophet's death in May of 1945, he served with Presidents George Albert Smith and David O. McKay. But nothing pleased him more than working in his library, where he wrote the manuscripts for his books and many talks. One of his best-loved conference talks addressed the rank and file church members.